Japan had a problem. One of their islands, Amami Oshima Island, had become overrun with snakes. But not just any snake. It was the highly venomous and deadly habu snake.
For 45 years, the forests of this Japanese island echoed with a quiet slaughter that almost nobody witnessed. An invader brought by human hands hunted down species that exist nowhere else in the universe, and every attempt to stop it ended in failure. Then one morning, the traps came up empty and stayed empty. What happened next left scientists around the world stunned because the ending almost nobody believed was possible. The day they finally won. In September of 2024, Japan's Ministry of the Environment did something it had never managed to do before on an island this size. It stood in front of the world and declared the war officially over. The small Indian mongoose, the invader that had terrorized Amami Oshima for 45 years, was gone. Not reduced, not merely controlled, but completely gone from the island. To understand how enormous that announcement was, you need to sit with the numbers for a moment. Over the course of the campaign, hunters and trappers captured 32,647 mongooses on that single island. The whole effort cost the Japanese government somewhere around 3.5 billion yen. That is real money, real years, and real human exhaustion poured into chasing down an animal that most people on the island never once saw with their own eyes. What makes this victory so extraordinary is not only the sheer scale of it, although Amami Oshima is the largest island on the entire planet where a mongoose population has ever been wiped out. It is a fact that almost every expert assumed the job could not be done. There are only a tiny handful of cases in all of recorded history where humans managed to remove mongooses after introducing them, and nearly all of those happened on small specks of land you could walk across in a single afternoon. Amami is a vast subtropical mountainous island smothered in thick forest. Removing anything from a place like that should have been hopeless. The very last mongoose ever caught on the island was trapped back in April of 2018. After that capture, the hunters kept going for years, walking the same forests and checking the same traps and finding absolutely nothing. The silence stretched on for so long that the scientists finally allowed themselves to believe what they had chased for decades. And here is the part that should make you lean in closer, because the reason this animal ever arrived in the first place was an idea that sounded perfectly brilliant on paper. A plan born from desperation long before a single mongoose set foot on Amami Oshima. The people living there were trapped in genuine daily fear of something else entirely. The habu, a thick and aggressive pit viper, owned the nights on these islands. This snake is a relative of rattlesnakes and puff adders, and it carries a venom that destroys flesh and blood from the inside out. For the families in those rural villages, a bite was not some rare horror story passed around at night. It was a constant threat hanging over the rice fields and the narrow footpaths they walked every single day. The numbers tell you just how bad the situation had become. Around the year 1980, roughly 400 people were bitten by habu snakes, and some of those people did not survive their wounds. You have to imagine living under that weight. Imagine sending your children outside in the evening, knowing what might be coiled in the tall grass waiting for them. For a long stretch of history, there was almost nothing anyone could do, because the anti-venom that could save a life only came in liquid form. Liquid medicine needs constant refrigeration to stay effective, and these remote villages often had no reliable electricity to keep it cold. The very places where the bites happened most were the places least able to store the only cure that existed. Running power lines through those mountains took years and cost a fortune, and the whole problem felt impossible to solve. So the authorities went searching for something simpler, something that nature itself could provide. They wanted a living weapon. They wanted an animal that could hunt the habu, survive its venom, and clear out the troublesome rats at the same time. The mongoose looked like the answer to every prayer they had. In 1979, about 30 of these small predators were released onto Amami Oshima to do exactly that job. There had even been an earlier experiment on nearby Okinawa, where 17 mongooses had been set loose decades before during the Meiji era. The logic felt airtight, and the people had every reason in the world to hope. But hope and biology do not always agree with one another. The men who released those mongooses were absolutely certain they had just solved a nightmare that had haunted generations. They had no idea they had just lit the fuse on something far worse than any snake. The reason the entire plan collapsed comes down to a few simple facts that nobody bothered to check before opening the cages. Why the perfect killer refused to kill. On paper, the mongoose looked completely unbeatable for this mission. These animals are famous all across Asia for fighting cobras, dancing around the strikes with reflexes that seem almost supernatural to anyone watching. They carry a special trait built into their nervous system that makes certain snake venoms far less dangerous to them than to other creatures. So the people of Amami naturally assumed their new recruits would tear through the habu population like a wildfire moving through dry grass. Here is exactly where the dream fell apart. The mongoose hunts during the day when the sun is high and the forest is awake. The habu hunts at night, sliding through the dark while the mongoose sleeps. These two animals were almost never awake at the same hour, which means they barely ever cross paths to begin with. You simply cannot kill what you never meet. And even on the rare occasion their schedules did happen to overlap, the mongoose looked at that large venomous snake and made the same cold calculation any clever predator would make. Why risk your life wrestling a creature that can kill you in seconds when the forest is absolutely overflowing with easy meals that barely fight back at all? Mice, rabbits, birds, frogs, and lizards were everywhere. The mongoose chose the easy food every single time, without hesitation. There is also a crucial detail the original planners got completely wrong about the venom itself. The famous mongoose resistance that everyone admired works best against the venom of cobras and their close relatives. The habu is a pit viper, an entirely different chemical weapon altogether, and that celebrated resistance does not protect a mongoose nearly as well against this kind of poison. So even the single advantage that justified the entire experiment was far shakier than anyone had realized when they made the decision. By the late 1990s, the truth had become impossible for anyone to ignore. The habu were still out there in the darkness, completely undisturbed and thriving. The mongooses, meanwhile, had accomplished the one thing they were genuinely excellent at. They had bred. By the year 2000, their population had exploded to roughly 10,000 animals, all of them hungry, all of them turning their full attention to the creatures that had no defense whatsoever against them. And those defenseless creatures happened to be some of the rarest living things on the entire planet. The slaughter of the living fossils. Amami Oshima is not an ordinary island by any measure. It is a place so biologically precious that the United Nations named it a World Heritage Site in 2021. The forests there shelter animals found absolutely nowhere else on Earth, species that survived for millions of years locked away in isolation. And that very isolation is exactly what doomed them, because these animals evolved alongside no fast-ground predator like a mongoose. They simply did not know how to run, how to hide, or how to fight back against something like this. The most heartbreaking victim of all was the Amami rabbit. Scientists genuinely call it a living fossil, and they are not exaggerating in the slightest. This dark, short-eared rabbit is the last surviving member of an ancient line of rabbits that once roamed the Asian mainland and then vanished everywhere except these few Japanese islands. It is a living window into a world that disappeared long ago. The mongooses found these slow, trusting rabbits and made them a primary target, and the population began to collapse rapidly. A creature that had outlived ice ages and the shifting of continents was being driven toward extinction by an animal that humans had released just a few decades earlier. The rabbit was far from alone in its suffering. The Amami spiny rat, another endemic species so biologically unusual that scientists study its strange genetics in laboratories around the world, was pushed right to the edge of survival. Native frogs, the Amami woodcock, and several other rare birds all felt the relentless pressure of the invasion. Researchers eventually counted around 15 native species seriously harmed by the mongoose. In just 20 short years, the habitat where some of these small animals could safely live had shrunk by close to 40%. The farmers got hit hard as well because the mongooses happily raided chicken coops and stripped fruit from the fields, then spread disease to whatever creatures they did not bother to eat. The damage grew so severe that by the year 2000, the Environment Ministry sounded a full alarm across the nation. This was no longer a failed pest control experiment that could be quietly forgotten. This had become a genuine ecological emergency, and the clock was ticking down fast on creatures that existed in only one place in the entire universe. The question the whole country now faced was brutal in its honesty. Were they willing to do something drastic and possibly cruel beyond words to undo their own terrible mistake? The hunters who walked the mountains. The answer turned out to be yes, and what followed became one of the most determined conservation campaigns the world has ever witnessed. The first attempts were almost embarrassing to watch. They set out simple traps along the roadsides, and the mongooses mostly strolled right past them. It became painfully obvious very quickly that catching 10,000 cunning predators across a mountainous jungle was going to require an entire army of people. So Japan built one. In 2005, the government assembled a dedicated squad of local hunters and trackers who became known across the island as the Mongoose Busters. These were not soldiers or scientists sitting in clean offices somewhere. These were ordinary people from the island, lacing up their boots before dawn and climbing into dense, humid, dripping forest day after day, year after year, to hunt an animal that had become their personal enemy. Over time, they learned its habits, its hidden trails, and its favorite hiding spots better than the mongoose understood them itself. The tools they used evolved steadily as the years dragged on. Engineers designed special traps shaped and sized so precisely that native animals could not get caught inside them, only mongooses. The team deployed toxic baits, scent attractants, and careful monitoring spread across the entire landscape. The real heroes near the very end, though, walked on 4 legs instead of 2. Trained detection dogs were brought in to sniff out the final few survivors hiding in a territory so enormous that human eyes could never hope to cover it all. Think about the difficulty of finding the last handful of animals scattered across hundreds of square kilometers of thick forest. The dogs took something completely impossible and made it merely very, very hard. Bit by bit, season by season, the population graph bent downward toward zero. 32,000 captures later, the forests finally went quiet. And as the mongooses vanished from the hills, something genuinely beautiful began happening in the shadows beneath those trees, something that made every brutal year of the long hunt feel worth the sacrifice. The forest comes back to life. This is the part of the story that still gives me chills, because nature, when you finally hand it a real chance, fights with everything it has to recover. As the mongoose numbers crashed toward nothing, the native animals that had been hiding and dying in fear for decades slowly began to reappear. Camera traps that once showed nothing but empty forest started lighting up again with movement. The Amami rabbit, the living fossil that had been circling the drain for so long, started to rebound. Researchers began spotting them in places where they had not been seen for years. The spiny rats came back from the brink. The native frogs and the rare birds gradually reclaimed the ground that had been stolen from them. An entire ecosystem that humans had very nearly shattered with one careless decision proved that it still held the strength to heal itself as long as the invader was truly and completely gone. Every single rabbit caught on those cameras was a quiet vindication of the thousands of grueling hours those mongoose busters spent climbing through the dark. I want you to sit with the strangeness of this for a moment because it carries a genuinely heavy lesson about who we are. To save these innocent native creatures, Japan had to kill more than 32,000 other animals that were only ever doing what their instincts commanded them to do. The mongooses never asked to be brought to that island. They did not choose to become invaders or villains. Yet leaving them alone would have meant erasing species that took millions of years to create and can never, ever be replaced once they are gone. There is no clean, comfortable answer hiding in that math, and the people who carried it out had to make a private peace with a kind of cruelty they never wanted any part of. It was the bitter price of fixing a mistake that should never have been made in the first place. The experts had actually warned about this exact outcome from the very beginning, and a chillingly similar story had already played out on the other side of the world long before Japan ever tried it. The hard truth is that Amami Oshima was not the first place to fall for the seductive mongoose promise, and the others were nowhere near as fortunate in the end. The warning the world refused to learn. Decades before Japan released a single mongoose, the very same idea had already gone catastrophically wrong across the planet, and the people of Amami truly should have known better. In Hawaii, sugar plantation owners were facing an army of rats chewing through their valuable cane crops. In the 1880s, they brought in mongooses from Jamaica and scattered them across the islands to clean up the rat problem once and for all. The result was almost identical to what would later unfold in Japan. The rats came out at night, the mongooses hunted by day, and the two enemies almost never met. Instead, the frustrated mongooses turned their hunger on Hawaii's defenseless native birds. Hawaii never recovered the way Japan eventually would. The mongoose is now blamed for helping wipe out multiple native Hawaiian bird species forever, creatures that survive today only in faded old photographs and dusty museum drawers. The government there missed its narrow chance to act early, and today removing the mongoose from the main Hawaiian islands is considered all but impossible. The same disaster repeated itself across the Caribbean, where a British planter brought mongooses to Jamaica in 1872 and triggered a chain reaction that devastated the local birds and reptiles for generations to come. On the small islands surrounding St. Croix, the story became almost too painful to even believe. A ground lizard that lived nowhere else on Earth was completely wiped off its own namesake island by hungry mongooses, leaving only a few hundred desperate survivors clinging to neighboring scraps of land. Conservationists had to physically rescue the very last of them and rebuild the entire population by hand, one lizard at a time. Across different continents and vast oceans, the same lesson kept getting written over and over in blood. When you drop a hungry predator into a world that never prepared for it, the innocent always pay the price first. That is precisely what makes the Amami Oshima victory so remarkable and so genuinely important for all of us. Japan stared down the exact same mistake that had defeated everyone else who tried it, and through nearly 50 years of stubbornness, science, and the aching feet of its mongoose busters, it became the rare place that actually managed to turn the disaster completely around. The fight is not fully finished even now because mongooses still survive over on Okinawa, where workers now use clever L-shaped fences to stop the animals from digging underneath the barriers and spreading. The danger of a fresh invasion always lurks in the background, but for one precious island, the living fossils are breathing a little easier tonight, and that is something very close to a miracle. So here is the question I keep coming back to, and I genuinely want to know where you honestly stand on it. Was Japan right to kill 32,000 animals in order to save species that exist nowhere else on Earth? Or did we simply create a second tragedy with no real winners at all? Share your honest thoughts in the comments below, because I read every single one of them.